There is a question that is as old as humanity itself. For some, it may be the most important question of all, but even today there is more and more people who don't want to hear anything about it at all. The question is, where do we come from? Or in other words, not just us, but the whole universe in which we live. Specifically, is this simply always been there, the natural course of things and a concatenation of more or less probabilities? Or is this the construct of an intelligent creator? That is the question. It is discussed very often, but rarely profitable. This could be related to the fact that the whole question is immediately shifted by some to the realm of the mystic. Religion, that's from the Middle Ages, who needs God? God is for people who are mentally unstable, who are looking for something that will help them or hope. He then looks for a God, but I don't need that. God and religion is something for people who can't cope with their lives. But you do a lot of injustice to the people who get well along in their life. But nevertheless you ask yourself this question. Or you say that the whole question is meaningless, because you can't prove God with scientific methods. Yes, that's not entirely wrong. You certainly can't do an experiment in a lab to make a decision at the end, is there a God or not, to have a proof. But that applies to many other things, including the existence of your great-great-great-great-grandmother. You can't prove scientifically, but it's logic that says there must have been one. The truth always has the better arguments. If this is the construct of an intelligent creator, then you have to be able to recognize that. If it is a truth, there are arguments for it, and if it is not, if it is a product of chance, there must be better arguments for it as well. Depending on what the truth is, but rejecting this notion from the outset, that there could be an intelligent constructor behind this universe. That's actually biased. It's not rational either. People don't do it that way. You reject something, just because you can't prove it? In the middle of the 20th century, scientists assumed that there was no life at the bottom of the ocean, but they didn't just say that. They didn't just say, we don't have any evidence of life down there, and that's why we reject it. They have argued and said that there is no light at the bottom of the ocean and therefore no life can exist there. They were fundamentally wrong in the end, but that's not even the point here. The point is that they didn't reject the idea of life at the bottom of the ocean just because you can't prove it. The same is the case with the aliens. There are scientists who say that aliens exist and others reject this notion, but both sides have arguments for what they say, whether they exist or not. In fact, people have always taken it for granted that this universe has an intelligent designer. Today it is said that in the past they had no explanation for many things, and that's why, when they saw lightning, they said there must be a God who throws these lightning bolts on the earth. But that's not quite right. People weren't like that. People couldn't explain all phenomena, but they did not explain simply everything with a God. People also didn't know why things fall down, or why wood floats on water. The explanation for this was not a God who keeps the wood floating, so that is certainly an injustice to the people. The reason is quite different. The reason is the nature of human. There is something that is deep inside of us, which can be summed up today in a single sentence. Nothing comes from nothing. This is something that any person would agree with, and we know this from an early age. When a baby is lying on the changing table and you snap your finger, it automatically looks in that direction. But why does the baby look there? Because the baby knows that there must be a cause for this sound. It doesn't just happen. It's already inside us, and the baby looks and wants to find this cause. And so people have always assumed that the world we live in must have some kind of cause. And this cause cannot be this world itself. The world cannot exist and at the same time be the cause of its existence. There was a time when it was simply assumed that this universe had existed forever. With this idea they wanted to more or less avoid the question, because if the universe was there forever, you tick it off. Now you don't need to ask the question anymore. Until, at the beginning of the 21st century, it was discovered that this world did not exist forever, and it was observed that this universe was expanding. You can't directly observe the expansion of the universe, but physicists found out that all the galaxies in this universe are moving away from us. Now, if everything is moving away from us, then the universe has to expand somehow. And that means conversely, if it continues to expand now in the future, that it must have been smaller and smaller in the past. Until you go back long enough, that the universe was united in a tiny little point. This is now called the Big Bang. This is also logically understandable. If you discover that it is expanding, it must have been closer together in the past. But not everyone accepted that at the time. The theory emerged in the course of the 20th century, and right from the beginning it was not accepted from a few. One of the most famous spokesmen for the opposing party was an astronomer named Fred Hoyle. And he said this observation that the universe is expanding, that's because new matter keeps coming into being, and this new matter pushes the old matter outwards, so to speak. The so-called steady-state theory. But why did he say that? Well, for Fred Hoyle, it was important that this universe had no beginning. He just didn't want that. This universe couldn't have a beginning. But why? He later explained it himself. He said, if you accept this theory, that everything has started from a point, then the question of where the universe comes from is actually unnecessary. Fred Hoyle was an ardent atheist, and the fact that the universe began at a tiny point was, in his opinion, an expression of the fact that the universe is an act of creation and therefore must have an intelligent creator. That was the reason why he rejected the theory of the Big Bang. But where did the universe now come from? If it is expanding from a tiny point, then it must still have come from somewhere? Where does it come from, and why did it start expanding in the first place? Well, the question is sometimes pushed aside today. Where did this universe come from? You can't answer that, because there was no time before the universe. Time only came into being with this universe. And you just push the question aside. But that actually doesn't answer the question. It is also difficult to deal with the whole thing with natural laws, because the laws of nature as we know them, they have arisen with this universe, but the question of the cause is independent of this. Laws of nature or not, there must have been the cause somewhere. This universe must have started somewhere, and this has actually been known not only since the Big Bang Theory. That's what people have thought at all times, simply by logical reasoning. One of them was the philosopher named Aristotle. He said this universe cannot exist forever, it must have had a beginning. And he had come to this idea quite interestingly. He said that if this universe existed eternally, then it meant that our past would be eternal. And that can't be. If the past were eternal, so to say infinite, we wouldn't be here today. That doesn't seem so accessible at first glance, so how won't we be here today? Explanation. Imagine it with a supermarket checkout. If you come to a supermarket checkout and you have a queue in front of you, no matter how long it is, you will eventually come to the checkout. At some point, you stand at the checkout and put your goods there and pay. But if this queue is endless, then you never arrive at the checkout. It never stops, it never ends. This means that if you queue up at the back of an endless queue, you already know that you will never get to the cash register. But that also means the other way around. When I stand at the front of the checkout at some point, I know that the queue in front of me can't have been endless. Then it would never have been worked through, and the same goes for the past. If the past had no end, if it were infinite, we wouldn't be here today. The very fact that we are here today means that the past must have a beginning and an end. That was Aristotle's reasoning. In fact, infinity is not part of our reality, it doesn't exist. You sometimes hear this when physicists say that there is a singularity in a black hole. This is an infinitely small point, with an infinitely small extent, with an infinitely high density. But that's just the helpless expression of a physicist to say, I don't know how to describe the whole thing that's in there. Infinities do not exist. What exists in this universe in reality is limited, it is never infinite. A colleague of Aristotle's philosopher Plato, he also said that this universe must be the product of an intelligent designer. However, he got there in a very different way. He said, design needs a designer. And design is recognizable right away. You don't have to think about for a long time. When you see something that has been designed by an intelligence, you recognize that immediately. You may know the Mount Rushmore, where the heads of 4 American presidents have been carved in. When you stand in front of this mountain and you see these 4 heads, you immediately know that this is a product of an intellect, that it didn't just come into being. And you don't know that, because you know that out of history class. We don't know that because we know that people are involved in sculpture. An Indian from the South American jungle, who has perhaps never heard of people chiseling, would recognize this. When he stands in front of this mountain, he immediately knows, okay, this didn't just grow away over the course of millions of years, there was an intelligent designer at work. Design needs a designer and design is recognizable. There are physical reasons why this doesn't just happen. Mountains grow in all sorts of directions. In the course of millions of years, it could theoretically be that 4 presidents' heads come out of it. In fact, it can happen theoretically. It's just so unlikely that such things will never happen. Such precise geometric shapes simply do not come out by chance. Because of the irregular shapes, there are many more possibilities for them. Statistically speaking, it just doesn't happen. It's far too unlikely. Design has to be added with an intelligence, otherwise it always looks irregular. If I want to make a regular shape out of it, then you need a designer. And that's not just for the president's heads at Mount Rushmore. That's how we go through our lives. And we would always recognize that right away. You can always distinguish one from the other. For example, if you see a cloud formation that reminds you of an elephant. Yes, something like that happens, and it is the product of a coincidence. But the 5 Olympic rings in the sky, drawn with clouds. That was an airplane. And that doesn't just happen by coincidence. A pile of stones can just fall off a truck, then it just lies on the side of the road. But a pyramid is the product of an intelligent designer and we recognize it right away. A pile of cards can just fall out of a deck of cards and the cards are lying on the floor. But a house of cards doesn't just happen. Theoretically, the cards could fall so fittingly that a house of cards comes out of it. It's not impossible, it's just so extremely unlikely that this will never happen in real life. You have to do that by hand. You have to design the whole thing. Now just look at this universe and you're just honest with yourself. What does it look like? Does this look like a bunch of irregular cards lying around, or does it look more like a house of cards? It's a house of cards, and that's not just a feeling in the heart, that's something science tells you. An astronomer named Dieter Hermann wrote his book, The Cosmos: Astronomy for Beginners. He mentions some interesting aspects about this universe towards the end of the book. He's an atheist, but he still has a certain fascination for this universe. He writes that if this universe, which we know is expanding, had expanded at the speed only 100 trillionths higher, then the whole universe would have flown apart. All the matter in it would flown apart, and stars and planets would never have formed. And conversely, this speed would have been 100 trillionths slower, the universe would not have expanded that far, and would have collapsed again a long time ago. Only 100 trillionths more, or less. He writes something similar about nuclear power. Nuclear power, not in the meaning in today's nuclear power plants. Nuclear power is the force that holds atomic nuclei together. And he writes that if it had been 100 trillionths stronger or weaker, atoms as we know them today would not have been able to form at all. It needs exactly this value. 100 trillionth is not quite correct. The numbers he mentions in his book are difficult to access or to understand. Herman actually writes about the speed, that if it were 10 to the power of minus 55, higher or lower by that factor, then we would not have a universe. But 10 to the power of minus 55, what is that? That's a number 0. And then 54 zeros and a 1 by that factor higher or lower, and this universe would not exist. And this is not only true for velocity, this is true for nuclear force, this is true for the gravitational constant, this is true for the gas constant. This universe has at least 20 properties or characteristics, that if they were to deviate by this crazy little number, any life here would be impossible. Roger Penrose, a British mathematician, once said that, in order to design a universe that produces life, you have to work so precisely. That would be like throwing an arrow at a dartboard. Except that the dartboard is the entire universe and you have to try to hit an atomic nucleus. That's how precisely such a universe must be designed. So again, what does that look like? Does it look like a bunch of cards just lying around irregularly? Or rather, like a house of cards? The universe is very special. Today, you sometimes think emotionally, well, it just exploded sometime, billions of years ago. And then stars and planets formed and now we're just here today. But it's not that simple. A universe that houses life is not that simple. And so far this is only the theoretical possibility that there could be life somewhere in the universe. But the universe alone is not enough. We still need a planet to live on. And not just any planet. This planet also needs special properties. Properties like planet Earth. Most people already know that you can't just position a planet somewhere in a solar system. You need a halfway acceptable temperature. This only exists at a certain distance and actually the Earth leads that excellently. Herman writes in his book that if the Earth were only 2% closer to the Sun, it would have heated the climate to such an extent billions of years ago that life would never have arisen here. And the opposite, if it were only 5% farther away from the Sun, then a huge ice age billions of years ago would have made life here impossible. So you can't just position the Earth anywhere. But it's not just the position either. This also applies, for example, to the size. You can't just take any size. Earth has a suitable size to be a planet that harbors life. If it were much smaller, like for example, the planet Mars, then the gravitational pull would not be sufficient to hold an atmosphere to this planet. And we can't live here without atmosphere. Now you might think that the bigger the better, the more atmosphere you have. But it's not that simple too. If you imagine a planet like Jupiter, you wouldn't be able to live there, not only because it's a gas planet, but because the gravitational pull is too high. A person who weighs 75 kilos here in the world would weigh 22 tons on Jupiter. And that would make life as we know it just as impossible. We have a beautiful matching value in size alone, a perfect size for life. And then we have the 4 seasons here. These seasons actually allow us to live life as we know it. You know the cycle that the trees bloom in spring and summer and then die again in autumn, before it starts again next year. The 4 seasons. But we don't have them just like that. Not every planet has them either. This planet has this, because the Earth's axis is tilted by 23.5 degrees. The tilt of the Earth's axis ensures that we have 4 different seasons here. But why did it tilt by 23.5 degrees in the first place? And why isn't that changing? The theory in science is that billions of years ago, the Earth at an early stage was hit by a rock from a meteorite or a comet. And it hit the Earth and torn out material. And this material is now orbiting the Earth in the form of the Moon. And at the same time, this impact tilted the Earth's axis by 23.5 degrees. The Moon, which orbits the Earth from now on, ensures that it is no more or less than 23.5 degrees. That's a crazy event, isn't it? There is simply the Earth, which flies harmlessly through space, and a boulder comes, hits it, tilts it into the right position, and ensures that a moon is torn out, which from then on orbits the Earth and ensures that it stays in this position. This is starting to look very, very random, doesn't it? Let's talk again about this atmosphere. It enables us to live on Earth as we know it, and it provides us with oxygen. But the atmosphere doesn't just consist of pure oxygen. In the atmosphere, that would be deadly, because the atmosphere has an oxygen content only of 21%. That doesn't sound like much at all, and large remainder is nitrogen. But why only 21%? Well, if it was 22%, then that would cause forest fires to start on a regular basis somewhere on Earth, and they would destroy all plant life. Oxygen is not only good for us humans, it's also good for the fire. That would be in the whole atmosphere only 1% more. That would have destroyed a large part of life here, and who knows if we would even have the possibility to exist. Now, you could say, okay, that's a bit dangerous. It would be better to have 1% less. But it's not that simple either. 1% less would make life here enormously difficult for us humans. That would mean that the oxygen content of the atmosphere is so low that if we just walked up a few steps of stairs, we would be out of breath. 21% is simply an optimal value for us. But we don't just have oxygen in the atmosphere, we also have carbon dioxide, the so-called greenhouse gas. It was actually discovered early in the 19th century that this gas is responsible for a greenhouse effect. But how did they get there? They once calculated how high the average temperature on Earth should be. You can calculate that. You know how much solar energy comes to Earth. You know the surface of the Earth. You know so and so much is water and so much is land. And now you can just start calculating. The water absorbs so much solar energy and releases so much. The land masses absorb so much solar energy and release so much back. And then they did the math, and they came up with a value of -14 to -20 degrees. That should actually be the average temperature here on Earth. But it's not. It's lovely 20 degrees average temperature. -14 degrees, which is about the temperature like in a freezer, and then it would have been difficult to live. So where does it come from? And even earlier they came up with the idea. Okay, in the atmosphere has to be a gas that holds a part of the solar energy back that was reflected by the Earth. And that's how they find out that that's actually carbon dioxide. That's only 0.04%. This is vanishingly small, but this small proportion already ensures that we have a pleasant living temperature here. 0.04% carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But that's still not enough. We need, for example, also a magnetic field. This is caused by a liquid core of the Earth. And due to the movement in the inside of the Earth, the magnetic field is created. And this ensures that harmful sun particles are diverted to the poles. Sometimes you can see these northern lights, which are an expression of it. These are very nice to look at, but they actually have a vital effect. If the core would stop rotating and we would have no magnetic field, then it would be difficult again. And on top of that, we have another fascinating property, not only here on Earth, but it applies to the whole universe. Namely, water. Water has an interesting property. If you put ice cubes in the water, you will notice that they float on the top. And we know that. We've seen it 100 times. It's actually nothing unusual. But it actually is. It is extremely unusual. Because ice is frozen solid water. Solid water floats on liquid water. And only water has this property. No other substance in the universe has this property. For example, if you heat iron to 700 or 800 degrees, it will eventually become liquid. When it cools down again, it becomes solid again. The upper layers get cold, they become solid and sink to the bottom. and then the next layer gets cool at the top, becomes solid and sinks to the bottom. And then, at some point, you have a complete mass of solid iron in front of you. This happens with all substances, all of them, except water. When water freezes and solidifies, it floats on the top. But that's not so interesting because the ice cubes float on top. This is vital. If it were not so, then rivers and lakes would freeze completely in winter. They would get cold at the top, the water would solidify, sink to the bottom. The next layer on top becomes solid and sinks down. And within a very short time, the whole river or the whole lake would be frozen. And then it will also be hard to live, but as it is, the ice floats on top. And this floating layer of ice has a maximum depth of 60 to 70 centimeters. This is enough for sunlight to penetrate through this layer. And at the same time, the water underneath remains liquid, and this allows the fish and other creatures to survive in winter. An interesting property that has only water. We have now a planet that makes life possible, but we don't get life only from that. Where does life come from? But we already know the appropriate explanation for this. 4 billion years ago, there was a huge primordial soup on this planet. It was just an ocean. There were building blocks for life in it. And now you had to add a little energy and bang, there was the first living cell. That's how you imagine it. Look, there is a mobile phone, and this one also has an interesting story. Do you know, of what is such a mobile phone made of? A mobile phone is made of plastic, among other things, and plastic is obtained through oil. And in my mobile phone there is a silicon chip. And silicon can be found in the sand, among other things. Oil and sand are available in abundance in some places in the world, including Iraq. And that's where this mobile phone comes from. It's already much older. The story for my phone is as follows. A few million years ago, a lightning struck in an oil well in Iraq, and this lightning turned the oil into plastic, not just into a pile of plastic, but into a suitable plastic case for my mobile phone. And then another bolt of lightning struck, but this time in the sand. And this second lightning strike, it turned the sand into a silicon chip. Not in just any silicon chip, but in a silicon chip with the right programming for my mobile phone. And then there was a small earthquake that kind of threw this chip into the plastic case. Then a little bit of water fell, so that it cooled down, and then the mobile phone was finished. Then, about a year and a half ago, I'm walking through the desert in Iraq and looking at the ground. Hey, there's a cell phone. I turn it on and call my wife. That's what you learn at school today. That's exactly like the story of how life comes to existence. I don't know what kind of idea people have today, but life is a highly complex matter. And we cannot fool ourselves by saying that it is the first primitive cell. The first primitive cell, that's not a simple thing. There are actually building blocks of life in nature, they occur. And you can also imagine that 4 billion years ago they were just lying around on the bottom of an ocean. But you don't have a living cell of that yet, you need the right building blocks. The building blocks of life are the so-called amino acids, molecular chains. And each amino acid comes in 2 different versions. Left turning once and right turning once. This is more or less the same molecular chain, only mirror inverted, like left and right glove. Now, life is made up exclusively only of left turning amino acids. So when you would assemble a cell, you are only allowed to use left turning amino acids. If you install even a single right turning one, everything is invalid, you can basically start all over again. Now let's take a very primitive life cells. How many amino acids do you need for that? Maybe 1,000 or 10,000. Let's just say 1,000, then we really have the most primitive thing you can imagine. 1,000 amino acids, but left turning. Let's imagine a huge bunch of amino acids thrown together at random. All building blocks for life are in it, and now you want to randomly pull an amino acid 1,000 times. and every time it has to be a left-turning one. If you catch a right-turning one, you can start all over again. What are the chances that this will work? You can type it in your calculator. That's 1 in 2 to the power of 1,000. Have a look at the number. But I'll give you a little hint. The number is significantly larger than the number of atoms in the whole universe. You're deluding yourself when you just say that there were a lot of building blocks back then and you had millions of years' time. That doesn't make it any more likely. Fred Hoyle, the well-known astronomer who rejected the Big Bang and the ardent atheist, he said that the idea that a simple living cell is created by the fact that the matching building blocks happen to be lying around somewhere. It's kind of like saying that a fully functional Boeing 747 is created by a hurricane sweeping across a junkyard and putting all the pieces together. Primitive cells are not simply as primitive as you might imagine. Maybe you've seen a children's show where simple cells are compared to factories. And that's how cells actually are. There's raw material extraction, there's raw material processing, there's something like an emergency off button, there's recycling. All this happens in a cell. Simple life is not just like that. But let's say we already have a living cell, however it came into being. Then we don't have humans and animals yet. Where did they come from? But even here we already have the appropriate explanation, the theory of evolution. Life is characterized by the fact that it carries with it a blueprint, the so-called DNA. And from one generation to the next, there are random changes to it, called mutations. And they also provide for randomly occurring new properties. And if they are good and help for survive, then it just keeps the new characteristic. And as a result, life always acquires new properties, always new characteristics, and thus how the different kinds arise. That's what we learn in school. Well, this may sound quite plausible, but it is actually a thing that can neither be scientifically proven nor disproved. It does not predict anything actually. The theory of evolution virtually eludes scientific verification. It's just an explanation that you provide, and as long as it clicks, and people say, aha, yes, that could be the case, that's how it's accepted. And of course, we know, it takes again millions of years. It is not possible to prove whether this actually happened. So, then that's just bad luck, then we just can't check this one thing. But that doesn't mean the theory of evolution is scientifically proven. But is that really plausible? Does it make sense? Is it so easy to imagine? So accessible? Imagine the first life form that had a heart. At some point, there must have been such an organism, on the way from the primitive cell to the human being. But how did that happen? The heart alone does not bring a survival advantage. What does the heart do? The heart pumps blood through the body, which means that we need at least a vein system, otherwise the heart makes no sense. But it doesn't bring any advantage for survival, it's actually more of a hindrance. But even the vein system alone does not help the heart, it pumps blood through it. So there must be a production facility for the blood somewhere, which happens in the bone marrow of humans. But well, that alone doesn't make it either. A heart with a vein system and blood production. There's still something missing. Blood is not an end in itself. Blood, for example, transports oxygen through our body. This means that we also need a lung that oxygenates the blood. And then the blood has to be purified. That's what we have the kidneys for, otherwise it won't work. All these things, even in a primitive form, must have been present in the first living being that had a heart. Otherwise, the heart alone makes no sense at all. Is it still so easy to imagine that this would happen? Through a series of random processes and mutations? I don't know, but there is more to life. Life also begets new life, and even that is fascinating in itself. We know this with us humans. The human being begins with a single cell. Everyone was once a single cell in his mother's womb. And that one single fertilized cell that doubles. It basically creates a copy of itself. Then you now have two cells. These two identical cells double again to create a copy, so it becomes 4. 4 identical cells, it becomes 8 identical cells, and then 16 and 32 and 64 and so on. But they are always identical cells, they are all just copies. There is no difference between the cells. But at some point, these cells specialize. This is because one cell or several cells become a lung in the baby, and other cells become a kidney. Some cells join together and become a foot, other cells become a hand, an eye. The cells specialize into certain defined cells. Not all the cells say, we want to be an eye, or we all want to be a foot. But of this bunch of identical cells, at some point some of them will start and let's say become an eye. But the cells don't have their own intelligence, they can't discuss it. What's behind it? What moves the cells, in which are no difference between them? Who tells them, you have to become an eye now and you become a foot? It can't be in the cells, because there is no difference at all in the cells. What causes cells to specialize? Does this still look like a random construct, overall? You just take a step back and be honest. Is this the product of a coincidence? You can certainly find another explanation for everything somehow, if you want. Then it could also be that this and that is. Yes, that sounds plausible, but it could also be this and that. This sounds like a lawyer in front of a court. He realizes that the burden of proof against his client is overwhelming and he wants to somehow avert it again. And there he comes with exactly such explanations. Yes, that is actually proven beyond doubt, but it could also be that his missing twin brother from Paraguay has suddenly appeared. It obviously doesn't look like a random construct at first. There are some people who say, yes, that's right, it looks like it's planned. But if it weren't like that, we humans wouldn't be here to think about it. That's a correct statement. But in the end, it means nothing else, except that if it were not like it is, then it would not be like it is. That is not an explanation. At least, this makes sense in the context of another theory, the so-called multiverse. You may heard the idea that there is not only this universe, but infinitely many. And this universe is just where it fits for us, the others are there too. But there are no people sitting there who can think about it, they just don't produce life. Okay, let's accept that for a moment, but what's so fascinating about this idea now? Someone is offended by the idea that there is a God, because you can't prove it scientifically. But doesn't have a problem with the idea of different universes? You certainly can't prove it scientifically at all. By definition, they are already undetectable, so what makes this notion more attractive now? But even if we apply this logic of the multiverse, then, of course, you could explain these improbable and almost inexplicable properties of the universe and life. Yes, that's true, but it can explain everything. You could not even say for sure that this universe obeys the laws of nature at all. Why do we believe there are laws of nature? We say this because we observe that the planets always move in a certain orbit around the sun. And that's been going on for hundreds of years, and that's why we say, yes, okay, there's probably a law behind it. It doesn't have to be that way at all. Maybe all stars and planets move purely randomly. But we're just the one universe, in which these random movements describe a circle, isn't it? There is absolutely no reason to assume that there are laws of nature in this universe. You can explain everything with it, really everything. Someone could win the lottery 50 times in a row and everyone would immediately say, wait a minute, something is not right here. He manipulated something, he has a connection to the lottery company or whatever. That just doesn't happen, but why not? If there is an infinite number of universes, why not this? We are just that universe, where someone is winning the lottery 50 times in a row. That is quite unproblematic, right? Nobody can really take this theory seriously. Multiverse is a thing that would never be accepted as an explanation, Never. But then, and only then, when it comes to the question of a God, then somebody suggests the multiverse, then suddenly everyone says, oh yeah. There is only one objection that is a little different from these others. And everyone has probably heard it before. If there is a God, why is there injustice? Why do we observe suffering and unhappiness? You are watching this world, and see all the suffering, and then you say that this cannot be the work of a God. But is that the right conclusion? Attention. People argue this conclusion only because they just don't want there to be a God. He could also simply say, okay, there is a God, but he has created a world with injustice, with suffering and misfortune. Because you still don't have an explanation for how all these coincidences come from. That doesn't give an explanation. You only realize that this world is uncomfortable. It's like sitting in an airplane and realizing you don't have any legroom. And now you said, okay, this plane that can't have a merciful designer. People have that, such a quality of mercy in them. But the plane, nobody built that who is merciful. There must be another explanation for this, but that does not refute the idea of a designer. And maybe the designer thought of something? He may have simply moved the rows of seats a little closer together, so that more people could fit on the plane and the airline could offer better prices in the end. That can also be a consideration, right? But if you just observe something you don't like and then at the same time immediately draw something conflicting like that, that doesn't make sense. There's something else behind that argue. That somebody, he wants to get there, he just doesn't want there to be a God. What can at least be said is that God did not create this world for enjoyment. That's absolutely right, because if there was no suffering, no unhappiness, then it would just be a beautiful life. He obviously didn't want that. That's obviously not the purpose of this world. But if there is a God, surely he should have created a perfect world for us? Yes, God has created a world that is perfect without suffering and unhappiness. But you cannot get there for free. And no, that's not this world. This place is called paradise. Who said it is this world? This world is indeed unjust in many ways, but you can't do real justice here either, as much as you sometimes wish for it. Imagine a person taking another person's life. And now you could say, okay, we want to establish justice, we're going to take this man's life too. That would be fair, wouldn't it? A life against a life. But what do you do with someone who has taken the lives of 100 other humans? Can you take this person's life 100 times? How to compensate for this? Or what do you do with someone who takes the life of another person and who may have been a family man, who took care of 10 children? But the murder was maybe such a lonely wolf, you wouldn't even notice if he is no longer alive. Would it be fair to simply take the lives of both of them? There is no justice in this world. And you can't make justice here either. This world, without a doubt, has its potential for injustice. But this injustice can be rectified in a world that is yet to come. This observation that there is injustice here is not wrong, but therefore your conclusion that there is no constructor behind it? No, that's not the right conclusion. Rather, it should make you say, okay, there must be something else where the injustice in this world is compensated. So why do you have this prejudiced notion against a God at all? Is this purely rational? Is this really a consideration that has been made? Or is it not rather because you don't want to? Because you don't like this idea? Because it's the Middle Ages? Because you just don't want to be one of those people who believe in a God or a religion? Well, if that's the reason, then you should be prepared for a surprise. Because the truth doesn't care how suitable you find it. The truth is probably the most merciless thing ever. It's just true, whether you like it or not. If you are standing on the roof of a skyscraper and the elevator is broken, then the way down the stairs is very exhausting. But now you can just say to yourself, okay, I'll jump over the edge of the roof, It's not exhausting and you'll automatically get down. Well, but now there's this attraction that pulls you down much faster than you'd like. You just say, I don't believe in gravity, the problem is solved, right? You jump and don't believe in gravity. That doesn't solve the problem. The truth is simply true, whether you like it or not. Here in this world, here you can argue and discuss for hours, but at some point we will all leave this world. And then the truth is just true. Earth's gravity strikes mercilessly. Happy is the one who has thought about all that before leaving this world.